No alarms sounded. No guards noticed. By spring 1962, the holes were large enough for a man to slip through. Above their cells was a narrow utility corridor, dusty and forgotten. There, the men built something unthinkable. Using raincoats, glue stolen from the prison workshop, and sheer ingenuity, they created a crude inflatable raft. But Alcatraz demanded deception. Each night, the guards counted heads by sight, not touch. Morris knew this. So he made a face, papier-mâché mixed with soap, toilet paper, and toothpaste, painted carefully with skin-tone pigments from the art room. Real human hair was stolen from the barbershop floor and glued into place. A head that could fool a tired man with a flashlight. On the night of June 11th, they were ready. The fog rolled in heavy. The bay disappeared. The guards grew complacent. At precisely 11:30 p.m., Morris slipped through the hole in his cell wall. The Anglin brothers followed. A fourth man, Alan West, failed to break free in time. Panic set in. Morris made the call that would haunt history: leave him behind. The three men climbed into the darkness above the cell house, reached the roof, and vanished into the night. Or so it seemed. Morning count came at 7 a.m. When Officer Hansen returned to cell 138, he reached through the bars and shook Frank Morris's shoulder. The head rolled onto the floor. Screams echoed down the cell house. Whistles blew. Sirens wailed across the island. Guards rushed in, guns drawn, disbelief written across their faces. 3 cells. 3 fake heads. 3 men gone. Within hours, the FBI, U.S. Marshals, Coast Guard, and local police swarmed the bay. Boats cut through the water. Helicopters hovered overhead. Debris was found: scraps of raincoat material, a piece of plywood, fragments of what might have been a raft. But no bodies. The official story came quickly. The men drowned. They had to. The water was too cold. The currents too strong. No one could survive that swim. That was the version the public was given, the version that preserved the myth of Alcatraz. But not everyone believed it. Because strange things began to surface. A blue raincoat fragment washed up miles away, where the currents shouldn't have carried it. A family in Brazil would later claim to have seen men matching the Anglin brothers' descriptions. A letter arrived at the FBI decades later, claiming Frank Morris was still alive. And deep in the prison archives, investigators found something unsettling. A report, quietly filed away, stating that the current on the night of the escape may have carried the men toward shore, not away from it. The Rock had lost 3 inmates. And for the first time in its brutal history, Alcatraz could not prove what happened next. But the escape was only the surface of a far darker truth. Because hidden behind the legend of Alcatraz were deaths never fully explained, punishments that crossed into cruelty, and secrets the federal government never wanted reopened. And when investigators reopened a sealed D-block storage room years later, searching for old maintenance records, they found something that wasn't supposed to be there at all. Something that suggested the prison's greatest failure wasn't the escape. It was what had happened to the men who never made it out. And that discovery would change the Alcatraz story forever. The boxes were never meant to be opened. They sat in a forgotten storage room beneath D-block, sealed with brittle twine and dust so thick it left fingerprints in the air. When the prison closed in 1963, most records were shipped to Washington, catalogued, stamped, and buried in bureaucracy. But some things were left behind. Misfiled. Ignored. Or intentionally forgotten. It was 1978 when Special Agent William Baker of the FBI stood in that room, sweating through his shirt despite the cold. Officially, he was there to assist with the final review of the Alcatraz escape file before it was permanently closed. Unofficially, he was chasing a feeling he couldn't shake. Something about the case never sat right. Baker had spent months rereading witness statements, tide charts, and internal memos. He had studied the Anglin brothers' childhood swimming records, Morris's escape history, and Coast Guard logs from that foggy June night. Every conclusion pointed in the same direction. They drowned, yet the evidence never fully cooperated. Too many maybes. Too many loose ends. The storage room smelled like rust and old paper. A single bulb flickered overhead. Baker cut the twine on the first box and lifted the lid. Inside were disciplinary reports. Not escape-related. Not maintenance logs. Death reports. Men who never left Alcatraz alive, yet whose endings were barely documented. Some reports were a single page long. Others were missing dates, names scratched out and replaced with typed corrections. One file in particular caught Baker's attention. Inmate Theodore Cole. Date December 16, 1937. Cause presumed drowning. Cole and another inmate, Ralph Rowe, had attempted an escape years before Morris. Guards reported seeing them enter the water. Bodies were never recovered. The official conclusion was the same as always: no one survives the bay. But Baker noticed something strange. The report referenced a witness statement that wasn't attached. He flipped through the box again. Then the next one. Nothing. Baker felt the slow crawl of unease climb his spine. Because missing paperwork at Alcatraz was rare. Deliberate omissions were rarer. As he worked deeper into the boxes, a pattern emerged. Inmates who died in isolation. Inmates who fell downstairs. Inmates who collapsed during work detail. All ruled natural causes or accidents. All investigated internally. All closed quickly. Alcatraz was designed to be escape-proof. But it was also designed to be quiet. The silence was what broke men first. Former inmates described it as a pressure, not an absence of sound but a constant awareness of it. Conversations were monitored. Laughing was discouraged. At times, prisoners were required to follow the rule of silence, speaking only when spoken to. Those who violated it were sent to D Block. Cell 14D. The hole. It was a concrete box, colder than the rest of the prison, stripped of light. Men were fed bread and water. Sometimes they were kept in total darkness. Officially, stays were limited. Unofficially, records were flexible. One man, Bernard Coy, had spent weeks there before participating in a failed escape attempt in 1937. Another, Joseph Bowers, was shot by guards while allegedly climbing a fence. The report claimed he slipped. Witnesses later said he never made it that far. These weren't rumors whispered by bitter criminals. They were statements given under oath, then quietly filed away. Agent Baker began to wonder if Alcatraz's real secret wasn't that men couldn't escape, but that some were never meant to. Meanwhile, outside the archives, the legend of the 1962 escape refused to die. In 1973, a Brazilian newspaper ran a small article about two American brothers living quietly on a farm outside Rio de Janeiro. The photos were grainy, the faces older. But to anyone who had studied the Anglin brothers, the resemblance was unsettling. The FBI dismissed it. In 1975, the Anglin family received a Christmas card postmarked from South America. It was unsigned. The handwriting didn't match anyone they knew. Inside was a simple message: "We are fine." The FBI dismissed that too. Then came the letter. In 2013, long after Baker's investigation had ended, a handwritten note arrived at the San Francisco Police Department. It claimed to be from Frank Morris himself. The writer said he had survived the escape, lived under an assumed name, and was dying of cancer. "I made it in 1962, the letter read. "Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The Bureau analyzed the handwriting, the DNA, the phrasing. Inconclusive, just like everything else. But Baker never stopped thinking about the boxes. About what might have been removed before he arrived. About why certain deaths were documented in detail, while others barely existed on paper. And about one memo he found folded inside a guard's personal file. It was dated June 12, 1962, the morning after the escape. It described an unscheduled inspection of D Block ordered before sunrise. The reason was vague. The results were redacted. But at the bottom, one sentence remained untouched. Unauthorized materials were discovered and confiscated prior to external investigation. The deeper investigators dug, the more cracks appeared in the official narrative. A raft fragment recovered days after the escape had been labeled non-essential and destroyed. A wallet belonging to one of the Anglin brothers was found floating near Angel Island, empty, suggesting it had been deliberately discarded. And a fishing boat captain reported seeing an object drifting silently through the fog on the night of the escape, low in the water, moving with purpose. His statement was never followed up. Too inconvenient. Then there was Frank Morris. No confirmed sightings. No family to step forward. No life left behind to trace. Except for one thing. In the late 1960s, a man under a different name was arrested in Mexico for a minor offense. He refused to be fingerprinted. Spoke perfect English. Had a scar on his chin that matched Morris's prison intake photos. Before U.S. authorities could arrive, the man vanished. Again. But the truth about Alcatraz wasn't only about who escaped. It was also about who didn't. In the 1990s, a group of independent journalists gained access to declassified Bureau of Prisons files. Buried among routine paperwork were medical reports that didn't match death certificates, autopsy notes that referenced injuries inconsistent with accidents, dates altered, names misspelled. One report described an inmate found unresponsive in D block, cause of death listed as heart failure. But the medical notes mentioned bruising around the wrists, restraint marks. Another file referenced a man who allegedly slipped during work detail and fell to his death. A witness statement, never attached, claimed he was pushed. Alcatraz was built to house the worst of the worst. But it was also built to protect itself. At any cost. In 2003, the U.S. Marshal Service officially reopened the Alcatraz escape investigation. Advances in forensic science, oceanography, and data modeling had shifted the conversation. What was once dismissed as fantasy was now a legitimate question. Could they have survived? After nearly a decade of analysis, the answer came back quietly. Yes. It was possible. Not probable. Not provable. But possible. In 2012, exactly 50 years after the escape, the Marshals closed the case again. Not with certainty, but with ambiguity. The final report stated that there was insufficient evidence to confirm the deaths of Morris and the Anglin brothers. In legal terms, they were still missing. Not dead. Missing. Today, millions walk through Alcatraz each year. They peer into Cell 138. They pose for photos near the bars. They listen to audio tours that describe the escape as a daring failure, a romantic myth swallowed by cold water. Few hear about the sealed boxes, the missing files, the internal memos. Fewer still consider the possibility that Alcatraz didn't lose its prisoners that night. It lost control. Because if three men could outthink the rock, then the rock was never truly inescapable. And if the prison lied about that, what else did it lie about? Somewhere, perhaps, Frank Morris lived out his final days under a different name, free but forever looking over his shoulder. Somewhere, perhaps, the Anglin brothers aged quietly, bound by a pact of silence stronger than steel bars. Or perhaps they died in the water, their bodies claimed by the bay, their story unfinished. The truth may never be proven. But one thing is certain. Alcatraz wanted the world to believe it was perfect, unbreakable, final. And the most terrifying possibility of all is this. Not that men escaped, but that the prison needed everyone to believe they didn't. Because the rock's greatest secret was never who got out. It was how much it was willing to bury to make sure no one ever questioned its power again. And if this story pulled you into the darkness, remember this. There are other prisons, other cases, other truths still waiting to surface. Some doors may be locked, but no secret stays buried forever. Alcatraz. Inside America's most escape-proof prison, the fog came first. It always did. On the night of June 11, 1962, a thick gray wall rolled across San Francisco Bay, swallowing the lights of the city and pressing tight against the jagged outline of Alcatraz Island. The guards on duty could barely see the water below the cellhouse windows, only hear it, cold waves slapping against rock with a steady, impatient rhythm, like something alive, waiting. Inside the prison, the sound meant safety. Outside, it meant death. At 11:30 p.m., Correctional Officer Eric Hansen made his final walk down D block, boots echoing against concrete. Every cell looked the same. Steel bars. Narrow bunks. Men breathing in the dark. The routine was sacred on Alcatraz. Count. Silence. Count again. Any deviation meant trouble. Hansen stopped at cell 138. Frank Morris lay under his blanket, face turned toward the wall. The shape was right. The breathing looked steady. Hansen tapped the bars lightly with his flashlight, a habit more than a requirement. No response. Good, Hansen muttered, moving on. He didn't know it yet, but he had just walked past the beginning of the most dangerous mystery in American prison history. By morning, 3 men would be gone. By nightfall, the entire country would be asking the same impossible question. Did anyone ever escape Alcatraz alive? Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was never meant to be humane. It was meant to be final. Long before it became a prison, the island was a military fortress, then a disciplinary barracks for soldiers who refused to obey orders. When the Department of Justice took control in 1934, the message was simple. This was where you sent inmates who couldn't be controlled anywhere else. No parole. No privileges. No second chances. The water surrounding the island was the real wall. Frigid, unpredictable, filled with powerful currents that could drag a man out to the open Pacific in minutes. Officials liked to say there were only 2 ways off the rock, release or death. The men who arrived at Alcatraz understood that immediately. Al Capone arrived first class, stripped of his power and reputation. In Chicago, he had been a king. On Alcatraz, he was just inmate AZ-85, scrubbing floors and learning to keep his mouth shut. George Machine Gun Kelly followed, along with kidnappers, bank robbers, and men who had stabbed guards in other prisons just to prove they could. Alcatraz didn't break men with violence. It broke them with silence. Inmates were allowed 1 book at a time. Letters were censored. Conversations were limited. The most feared punishment wasn't the hole. It was isolation in D-block, where days blended into weeks and the only sound was your own breathing. And yet, even here, some men didn't stop thinking about escape. Frank Morris was one of them. He arrived in January 1960, thin, sharp-eyed, and already labeled a problem. His record showed a childhood spent bouncing between foster homes and juvenile detention centers. By his teens, he was stealing cars. By his 20s, robbing banks. He had escaped from prison before, more than once. The Bureau of Prisons believed Alcatraz would end that habit. Morris disagreed. He studied everything, guard routines, ventilation grates, the way sound traveled at night. He noticed that the concrete around the vents beneath the sinks was crumbling from years of salty air. He noticed how the guards relied on routine as much as the inmates did. Most importantly, he noticed who was watching, and who wasn't. John Anglin and Clarence Anglin arrived months later. Brothers. Quiet. Smart. Bank robbers, yes, but disciplined ones. They grew up swimming in the rivers of Florida, strong enough to fight currents that terrified other men. Morris watched them carefully. Trust on Alcatraz was rare. Dangerous. But the 3 men shared something that couldn't be taught. Patience. 4 months. Nothing happened. Then, slowly, changes began. At night, when the cell house settled into uneasy silence, Morris would pull a stolen spoon from beneath his mattress and chip away at the concrete behind his sink. He worked carefully, covering the noise with accordion music played by another inmate during evening recreation. Bit by bit, the hole grew. The Anglin brothers did the same.